Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is an interview with Erin Loechner, who is the author of The Opt-Out Family: How to Give Your Kids What Technology Can't. And our conversation is centered around being a low to no tech family, meaning that we don't have smartphones, we don't have tablets, we might not have laptops or, anything unless it's like you really need them for work kind of thing, but really trying to be intentional about what kind of technology comes into your house and who has it, and not just assuming that every kid is going to get a phone and that you're going to have a smartphone and that everyone's going to have tablets. And really about the challenges that come with living a low-tech or no-tech lifestyle, and also the benefits and the gifts. I thought this was a really great conversation. I personally have been concerned that we are part of this massive experiment on what screen time does to us and our families and our kids, and what having smartphones does to us and our families and our kids. And it was really great to be able to talk about this and talk about some other options. And Erin actually said that parenting gets a lot easier when you don't have all of this tech stuff. So it was a really great conversation. Again, inspiring. And, there are ways that you can take some of what she says and leave some of what she says. But I really think that we do need to rethink the inevitability of when your child gets a phone, and maybe think about if your child is going to get a phone, or when they get a tablet, to if they're going to get a tablet. And also thinking about how screen time affects us and how our smartphone use affects us. And really just this is an invitation to think about, do we want to live in a different, more intentional way? And I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. And let's meet Erin. Okay, I lied. Before we meet Erin, I have to say one more thing. And I'm actually putting this into the podcast after Corey listened to the podcast, because she always reviews them before we put them out as published. So Corey and I just had a long conversation about this podcast, and she felt that it was important that I come on here and say that this podcast might not resonate for you. It might not feel right for your family, and that we want to make sure that you all know that we know that everyone makes the choices for their family that are right for them. And you might be a family where you wouldn't even consider opting out of technology because it serves you and it serves the needs of your children, and that's okay too. So what we really want to do with this podcast is we want it to be a thought-provoking conversation. And we want everyone to still feel, though, that if you come away ultimately feeling this wasn't for you, that's fine too. And that I wanted to call out that Erin, our guest, is coming from a very specific place as a homeschooler, as somebody with financial privilege, and what works for her and what she's recommending might not be what works for you. So take everything with a grain of salt. Take what works for you. Leave what doesn't work for you. I still do think that this question of, it's not when do we get our child a personal device, but if, and also the question of how much do we want technology to be present in our family lives, are still good questions to ask. This is just a little bit of I don't want to say warning, but it's a little bit of an acknowledgement that for some of you, this podcast could actually be the wrong way, because you completely fundamentally disagree with the idea that technology doesn't have a huge role and shouldn't have a huge role in family life. Peaceful parenting, Corey and I were talking about this. Peaceful parenting does not have a stance on screens. It's always, how does it work for you? What's the balance? Does it help your child feel regulated, or is it dysregulating? There's nothing in peaceful parenting that says screens are good or screens are bad. It's such an individual conversation. And so here's some more fodder for conversation and for thought. And let's really meet Erin this time. Hi, Erin. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk about being an opt-out family. I actually heard about your book because one of my members in my Peaceful Parenting membership was reading it and said, we're trying some things from this book. And so then I had to look it up and it's fantastic. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. Then we'll
Yeah,
talk
my
about
name
what
is
is an opt-out family.
Of course. My name is Erin Loechner. I'm an author, and my husband and my three kids, they're 12, 8, and 4. We live in the Midwest and also the West in the summer. And we homeschool. We just really kind of frame our days from a place of learning a lot about the world and each other. And it's a wonderful time.
Great. And so what is an opt-out family and what are we opting out of?
Yes, my definition of an opt-out family would simply be anyone that is kind of parenting from a place of the recognition and awareness that every time you opt into a form of technology, whether it's an app, a platform, a personal device, you are kind of joining this sort of assembly line, if you will, of whatever tech will require of you next, whether that's an update in terms and conditions or any sort of change of the algorithm. You are a bit at the mercy of Silicon Valley at that point. And so for us, we define opt-out family as someone that questions the idea that, yes, technology might be the future, but is it the future that we want? And operating from that place.
Mm-hmm. And do we want it in our daily lives?
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
It looks very different for many different households. A lot of those setups or strategies are in the book, but for us, it means no personal devices. I have a dumb phone. My husband has a smartphone that we use for travel, but pretty much in the daily rhythms of our home, they're just not present.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that it could look different for other families. Do you mind giving a few examples of how it could look different for some families and some other families?
Yeah, some families just simply set limits on social media. That's a big one that I think a lot of people have had probably the greatest success in setting that limit. Some people don't use email at all. That's one side of the spectrum. Other people just realize we don't want personal devices. We might have a shared family iPad that's docked somewhere that everyone shares. We might have a desktop computer that's open for internet access for older kids. There might be screen time, parental controls, all of that. A lot of the people that I spoke with really just recognized at some point that setting these screen time regulations were providing a barrier in the parent-child relationship. So I
Oh,
would say the thing that we all have in common in terms of the way that we are utilizing tech is we are not saying no to devices, we're saying yes to something better. So we're not kind of acting as tech lords or digital managers. We're just saying, what if we don't, right? What if we don't operate from the screen time regulation and we just work on the relationship on the other end? And we're not working from coercion, but we're cooperating with our kids to say, okay, well, what is it that's drawing you to this device? And how can we create something better together?
yeah. One person that was on my podcast last year, Dr. K, the healthy gamer. I don't know if you know him at all, but he talked about when you have a kid he works with teens with screen gaming addictions. And he said that the only way that you can really address it is address what is it taking what need is it filling? Right?
Right.
Like what if you have a kid who's addicted to video games, there's a reason, right? Like they're looking for connection, community, fun, and it sounds like you're sort of saying one of the big features of or a big factor in opting out is not just like opting out and then nothing, but like filling your time with fun family stuff and activities.
Yeah, our family motto is be more engaging than the algorithm. And that stemmed from a very personal place as a former social media influencer. And so I just knew from the get-go, this platform, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it may be, is filling that need for adults as well as kids. We're not the kids are, it's not a kid problem. It's an everything. I wanted to know from these tech companies, how do you create the most engaging atmosphere that really draws us in and wants to leave us there? How are you doing it? I was curious about that. And so I interviewed 250 resources in and out of Silicon Valley. And I wanted to know from TikTok, how do you create an inviting environment? I wanted to know from Minecraft, how do you introduce a challenge that is so exciting and enriching, but not demotivating, right? Because there's a lot of beauty to be learned from these things that our kids love. And I wanted to know, how do we create those things in our own home while still setting the limits that our kids need?
Right. So you just mentioned that you're a former social media influencer. How did you make the journey from social media influencer to opt out family/parent?
Yeah, it's a big shift. I fell into social media influencing in the early days because I was an HGTV.com host. And so at that time, this was pre-social media, and my editor was once Instagram came out, was kind of like, people want to know more from you, and they want to see your personal life and what your background is, and they want pictures of your lunch, right? And so I joined with the recognition that as a public person, my kids weren't also signing up for this. And so it all coincided with the birth of my first child. And I recognized I'm not going to be sharing her face online. I'm not going to be sharing her name online. I wanted to give her agency over any sort of presence that she has on the internet going. And so I was always very boundaried in my usage. And yet, like algorithms do and these apps tend to do, it required more from me than what I was willing to give. And so I think I recognized when when my oldest was 2, maybe 3, that if I was to continue the career path of an influencer and be sort of have this be my main career, I was going to be parenting with my phone in my hand a lot more than I wanted to. And there was no amount of, narration of, right now I'm responding to this text or this comment that that would make up for the fact that I was going to be on my phone and my child wouldn't see my eyes. And I wasn't willing to do that. I also recognized my husband had worked for Apple Ad Agency, and we kind of knew how the sausage was made. We knew that things were probably going to get a little bit more prevalent and that the algorithms were going to be changing in a bit of a downward spiral. Now all that research is here and we have it. And I'm grateful for that. So we sort of were looking ahead and thinking, we don't know that social media is a place we're ever going to be able to encourage our kids to go. It's not a playground we wanted them to be playing in. And so I think at some point, every parent has to reconcile, how am I going to navigate that? And I didn't want to move forward from a place of hypocrisy and say, well, it's fine for me. It's not fine for you. It's fine for me to have this as my job, but it's not okay for you to be curious about what happens in that place. So I wanted to just see, okay, well, what if I go first? What if I recognize these are all tension points my child is going to experience too, and what if I start asking these questions for myself and I start experiencing some of these answers for myself so that I can work from a place of experience and say, gosh, yeah, it is really hard when you're not part of the group text thread. Here's what I do. It is really hard when you go to the restaurant and there's just a menu that's a QR code. Here's what I've done. And they've gotten to see, and now my oldest is 12 and she's gotten to see the whole gamut of all of these things that we experience just not having a smartphone. And it's a really beautiful way to walk it out with her rather than against her.
Do you get a lot, I mean, if you don't mind sharing, do you get a lot of pushback from your 12-year-old
No.
about, no?
No.
Okay.
Her friends all have phones. They do.
Yeah.
But this has been an ongoing narrative since I remember, we took all of our kids out on a date, and we still do this really. And we just say, what do you notice? Let's look around. What do you see? Every one of them as toddlers said, why isn't anybody talking to each other? Why is everybody on their phone and like in this like individualized world? And they all thought it odd as toddlers. And so I think very often of the quote that says, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And I think children feel that often and yet don't kind of have the words to explain it. And so without projecting what we think at all, we do ask them a lot of questions, and we do talk about this all the time. And it's interesting how many kids and young teens that I interviewed that said, this isn't the world that we wanted. This isn't the world that we asked for. It's the world that we got. And oftentimes our parents think we're addicted to our phones, but we're not. We're on our phone because they're on their phone or because our friends are on our phone. We don't know any different. And so one of our solutions was really to open our home as a low tech hangout zone. So we have, a little poster on our door that's pretty tongue in cheek about the fact that, you come into this home, you're not going to be tracked. You're not going to be asked to perform for TikTok. You're not going to have a camera in your face. You're not going to be interrupted by texts or phone calls or anything. This is this is free. This is a free space, safe space. The parents in the neighborhood will send their kids over. They love it. And that's kind of the trade-off. That's our version of being more engaging. That's our version of saying yes to something better than devices. So our 12-year-old would far prefer that than what she sees happening in the homes of her friends, which is that everybody's in the same room, but
Yeah.
connected.
Not engaging. Yeah, they're not engaging with each other. In where I live in Ontario, they recently passed the thing that kids aren't allowed to have cell phones in schools or in the classroom. Just started in September, and I think like they have to leave them in their bags, or the teacher collects them or whatever. And my daughter is in grade 12. She's a senior, and she came home after like a couple days into the school year, and she's like, "Mom, you know the new cell phone ban?" And I was kind of expecting her to say something negative, but she said, "It's so great." And she just really appreciated. She said kids are talking to each other. They're like doodling on their papers if they don't have anything to do. And I think you're right. Like just that's one example of kids that they wish that not everybody was on their phones all the time.
Yeah, they have permission to talk to each other. And yeah, every single child that I asked, a lot of kids, what would you change about your school? And they all said, well, we have a phone free policy, but it's not enforced. And I would really like it to be enforced. I would like to
Yeah.
see what happens if nobody's allowed to have their phone at the lunch table.
Yeah. It's tricky. I mean, this is a little bit off the topic of the family, but it's tricky with schools because so many parents want their kids to have phones so they can call them at any time? And I'm like, well, remember in our day when we just called the school administrator and then they did the PA to the classroom if you need to talk to somebody. But I mean, that's part of it too. I bet that you come across as parents saying, but wait a minute. I want my kid to have a phone so that I can always know where they are or I can get in touch with them all the time. What do
Yeah.
you tell parents who are, I want to get a little bit more afterwards back to kid objections, but what do you tell parents who are wary of giving up that I'm going to say perceived level of control and safety because I think it's a false sense of control and safety a lot of times.
Well, and we have to take away the false sense of safety to experience, you know, uh, it's like life is not always comfortable. And I think we have in our head that trusting our kids and tracking our kids is the same thing. And it's not. And so we have to just practice trusting them. And the only way to do that is not to track them and not to know their whereabouts at all times. And that just part of independence and natural that movement of child to adulthood requires that we not know their whereabouts at all times, or that we not be so closely intertwined with their spheres of agency and authority and independence. And so I actually interviewed a lot of security experts and, people in law enforcement just saying, okay, well, is it safer? I think of something like Live 360. Is it actually safer? Do you have a lot of evidence about what happens in case of emergency if they do or do not have it turned on? And the fact is, just by having a device, you're pinged everywhere at all times. So in case of emergency, your whereabouts could be found by law enforcement. But all of them said in case of a school situation, it is far safer if there is some sort of emergency scenario to not be the phone is the last thing you want to have on hand because you need to be available and present and undistracted to be able to listen to the people that are attempting to direct traffic or whatever's happening in the moment. And so there is a lot of evidence to the contrary that actually your child even having a phone outside of your home makes them safer. It introduces a whole different amount of harms. So a lot of that is in the book, a lot of the pushback of what we think in terms of conventional safety and trust. I just really wanted to kind of poke some holes in that and get curious about are we actually safer with cell phones or is it false? Is it a false sense of security?
Yeah. And I also think that if parents think, oh, well, if my kid gets into trouble, they'll just call me and I'll get them out of this jam, doesn't give kids the skills that they need or the scaffolding that they need to know what to like. You always need to know what to do if you get lost or you need some help from somebody. Who do you ask? So I think that it's without the crutch of the phone, you have to teach your kids those things.
You do. And there's a difference between being available to your children and accessible to your children and then, omnipresent to your children. And I want rather than to teach them that I'm their only out, I want them to teach them that they have a lot of those skills inherently themselves and all in this wide village that they can rely on. I want them to point to many people rather than just me that they can trust and that will help them and that they can put their faith in.
Yeah, I love that. So I mentioned before the pushback from kids of not having a personal device because so many parents that I work with, even starting from like 7, 8, 9, the kids like, I need an iPhone, I need a smartphone. Everybody else has one. How do you what do you suggest that parents, like, how do they support kids in this decision that they're not going to get a smartphone? Or maybe part of opting out is you don't get one until high school or something like that. Even delaying, I think, is better than early devices. But how do you support parents when their kids are pressuring them? Like, what
Yeah.
would you say?
We always ask our kids questions. We're constantly talking this through. But, one thing that we ask kind of proactively, when their friend, because of course they'll come home and they say, oh, our friend got a phone and she's obsessed with it or whatever. And so now like she's taking pictures of everything. And they'll say it not in this, it's not instantly negative. It's generally like there's been a change here, something
Mhm.
off, something feels different. And so we just sort of explore that with them and from a very neutral third party perspective because they sense the change themselves. And it really takes just a couple weeks. I interviewed a mom in the book whose 13-year-old coined the phrase, he's a phone person now.
I was going to say that. Yeah. Phone person now.
And and so one thing that she did that I really loved is she would just point to all of the ways in which his lack of device has helped him excel in the areas that he truly cares about. So he said, she said, think about your jump shot, look at your jump shot, not in comparison to the other kids, but look at all of those hours that you have put into your jump shot and that you're continuing to practice. Why do you think you're the one that can do it best on the team? Why do you think that is? And inevitably he's like, okay, mom, because, because I'm not on my phone and they are. And so kind of establishing some of those goals that your child has, what do you want to do with your childhood? What do you want to do with your time? Your free time is so precious. And what do you want to explore? And how can I support that? Really, nothing is off the table. We've got a library card and we've got access to the outdoors and many things that we can explore together. And being willing to do that, which is often the harder, commitment. It truly is. But I would just really explore a lot of that with your child before the phone conversation comes up. And then once it does, I think it's really okay to just set those limits and say, you know what, that's not something that our family's going to be doing. How can we work together? What's our
Mhm.
solution? It's not a no, it's a yes, how? How can we make your love or connection? If you're feeling left out, how do we just solve that?
Yeah.
What is the reason? And a lot of times it is just because, well, everybody else has one. I don't want to be the different one. And so we often in our family are reading memoirs about people that went against the grain in history and that did things differently. And we like exploring that together and looking at the benefits of that.
And you mentioned feeling left out, and that's the one thing that I think as a parent, it would be hard to how do you facilitate okay, say had younger kids and we're not getting cell phones and I think it would be hard to have them feel socially still connected when everybody else that they're friends with connects via, apps or, texting or whatever. Like, how can you help a kid stay socially connected when most kids these days are connecting through their personal devices?
Yeah. One thing that we recommend, we have chapters all over the world called Co-opt Out. And the idea is it's not just a social circle for your kids, it's multi-generational. So the idea is just going a couple generations ahead and a couple generations behind and getting together weekly, whether it's just, a pickup ball game in the park or a book club or just some common interest, but getting together weekly to surround yourself with all of those people who are aligned in this idea that do we actually need a personal smartphone device in our pocket to be socially connected? I do not believe that's true. And so, can we have this vibrant, wide social circle without the ability to be reached 24/7? Yeah, I think we can. And so I think for us, we have just chosen, okay, well, let's make sure that we've got regular weekly and daily rhythms to support our kids' social lives. So it looks like tea time every Wednesday. We have weekends at the park every week. It's open to whoever wants to come. We work really hard on making sure that there are our inner circle is diverse and varied in terms of age. And one of the benefits of that is the kids coming up behind your kids are going to be seeing how you parent and seeing that your kids are doing things a little differently. And they're going to value seeing what the richness of that looks like. And then having, kids a little bit further. So we have teens in our home often. So our 12-year-old has people to look up to and says, well, gosh, they're not socially isolated. They're not total weirdos, and they don't have a phone, and I think they're pretty cool, and I like this about them. So just just I think being aware and mindful that there are a lot of different people to introduce your children to invite into your own home, that and it's not the most convenient things in terms of time or mess or, food budgets, but it's choosing your heart, and that's kind of what we have opted to do instead of just going with the, "Okay, yeah, everybody else has one, and so here's the phone." But that's not to say, you can't have a landline, you can't have, I always think like an '80s parent. Well, what did we do? I think for the younger set, walkie-talkies are a great solution. I think for the older set, you can do many things with a flip phone in the glove compartment of the car. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I just think it's about finding what you want to do as a family and just constantly questioning, is this worth it to me? Is the cost actually something that I'm willing to pay in terms of emotional and financial cost?
Yeah, I like how you said choose your hard. And maybe for people listening who have younger kids, you can find some people now who are willing to go down this road with them, right? Like let's all band together and because it sounds like you do have a community of people who are on this path with you. But for anyone listening who doesn't, maybe trying to find that community and see if you can, you know, try and find peers for your kid who is also
Yeah.
going to be in the same boat. And I was going to ask you if you have a landline, because
Yeah.
that's another objection that I hear. Well, how would I, if there was an emergency, how would my kids get in touch with me or how would I get in touch with them? I heard a really funny thing. Well, on social media, I heard this woman talking about how she was a nanny for a family with three kids, I think, and that she was out with one of the children taking them to a lesson and she was trying to get in touch with the other kid who was at home and they weren't answering their, I don't know, something she couldn't get in touch with them. And she finally got in touch with them and they're like, wouldn't it be great if there was a phone that was at home that just anybody could answer? She said, yeah, we used to have those called landlines.
Oh my gosh, I had a kid say because there was a parent that couldn't ever find their phone or whatever, and he was like, "They should just put them on the wall, like, have the wall." That's what they used to do. That's right.
Yeah, that is funny.
Uh,
We still have a landline because cell service isn't great where I live, but people are always like, "You have a landline still?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's great. It's nice to have."
Right, and there are a lot of options to turn, an old device into a landline. There's the Magic Jack, and in a lot of states and here in the US, you can just, put any working phone into, like an old, like, wall phone into a jack, and it can be used to call 911. So even if
Okay.
without having, the cable service or whatever. So
Right.
if you just have just a phone from the thrift store that you wanna plug in, it should be able to reach 911 without the service of,
Okay, that's good to know.
yeah. So it's worth researching in your state for sure.
Yeah. What are some of the benefits that you've seen from being an opt-out family or you've seen others experience that we haven't covered yet?
Yeah. I think a big one is there tended to be, from a lot of the parents that I talked to, just a wide uptick in creativity. There was a lot of independence and problem solving. And, when we think of kids that have kind of the skills that they would need to interact on a level of EQ rather than IQ, right? Like that, just have high levels of empathy and personal skills. And all of that does come out in a lot of the way that these families speak and to and about their kids. And I have not delved into the research of why that is, but I do know watching them interact with one another, there's just a mutual respect. There's not this barrier between them where, kids are feeling like their parents are overstepping their boundaries in terms of their social life, which I think often happens when we give our child a phone and then we say we're going to monitor every interaction on that phone. The child feels like, "Do you not trust me? Why then give me the phone if you don't trust me?" And that's an adequate response, It's like a fake trust. And so a lot of the kids, I think even if begrudgingly they're not loving this limit initially, they look at their friends and say, "Well, I think I'd rather that than rather be tracked all the time." At least my parents are inviting my kids over. And a lot of the times the kids would say, I love coming to your house because there's lots of things to do, and there's always action happening around. There are things available to do and explore that aren't just on my phone or just with a device. So the home feels different. A lot of people will comment on maybe just the maturity level of these kids. There's a lot of eye contact. There's a lot of reading social cues, reading the room that maybe isn't there if the child has been overusing a device,
Mhm.
which I think just even, when we look at P standards and a lot of the general narrative about screen time usage, it's that less is more, but we don't have any adequate standards. What does less mean? Is it an hour? Is it 2 hours? Is all screen time created equal? The more you get into the nitty-gritty, the more it feels really impossible to regulate. And so it's one of those things where maybe moderation isn't the answer. Maybe just make a decision for what you're willing to introduce in the daily rhythm of your home and have your home feel different and see what happens.
Yeah. I often worry that we're in the middle of this really, like, big social experiment that's not gonna end well with especially when I see little kids, and I don't want anyone to feel judged or thrown under the bus who's listening here, because I know sometimes parents are just doing the best they can, but I do see, like, those toddlers in the wagon. I live right next to a really big public park, and I see, families out for the day and, like, the toddlers in the stroller in the park just looking at the parent's phone or an iPad or something. And I'm like, look at the birds, look at the trees, like play. And, I really worry about that, just about the ubiquitousness of kids, like small kids with iPads that I see these days.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I do. And I love this is absolutely a conversation where I think there is a lot of perceived judgment around it. And I think just speaking plainly about some of the harms and that it's not, it's an interesting thing that we're blaming parents for something in which we have absolutely, we have integrated technology into our society as a whole, right? It's in our schools, it's in our churches, it's in our homes, kind of the benefit of what we would call progress. And we were sold something that we were convinced would help our kids, right? Think of the STEAM skills and the STEM skills and the betterment of technology. And we're going to be creating programmers and AI is coming. So we got to prepare the kids for AI. So we were sold something that did not deliver. And so why are we blaming ourselves? Just get the
Mm.
thing out of the home. That's what, just try that and see what happens. But don't, cozy up to Silicon Valley as if they're your friend because they're not your friend. So
Mhm.
that is what I would tell. It's almost like let this don't turn this conviction inward and make it into a guilt. Use it to fuel some of those everyday decisions that you have the agency to make as a parent. And a lot of times I'm asked, well, how do you find those other people who can rally around this idea with you? How do you find your social circle when the whole world has seemingly adopted tech? And really, the best way is to push back in those areas. Go to your school and say, hey, is there any way that we can have, attendance record where they're not signing in through an app or a tech platform? Is there any way that we can have these clubs meeting in a way that doesn't require Snapchat? Is there a listserv, an old phone tree? Is there something that we can do for the opt out kids, for the kids that don't want or have a smartphone? Can we just find a way to communicate with one another in a way that we used to? And I understand, from the teachers and the coaches and the principals' perspective, a lot of times we adapt this tech because it streamlines the process, it streamlines communication. And so be the parent to offer to streamline it for them. Be the parent to say, I am so willing to step up in this fight because it's so worth it to me to protect these children, to give them a different future and to give them a skill set that they're not getting. It's worth it to me. And so I will be the one to sign up to moderate the email listserv and to send out the weekly reminders. And I will be the one to get everybody together and do all the administrative tasks. And I know that's a big ask for working parents, And so a lot of parents I talked to gave it to their kid to do, if their kids 14, 15 said, hey, let's teach you how to manage an email list and send out these reminders. And can you find a way to make it fun? And soon enough, the kids now are in charge of getting the club together rather than the administrators, which is an even better skill. So lots and lots of alternatives that don't involve introducing something that will be more addictive than perhaps a wagon stroll, looking at the birds and looking at the flowers and being in nature. So it is a win-win overall.
So I mentioned my membership before, and we have a monthly theme every month, something that we dive into. And one month we did screen time and like looking at just, setting our intentions around that and limits. And the next month we did parental burnout. And I realized I should have done them in the other way around. You should have done them the other way around, right? Because I think a lot of parents default to letting their kids have screens or more screen time than they actually feel comfortable with because they're burnt out. And one of the objections, quote objections that I had to ask you about was, this sounds like a lot more work. I mean, to be clear, I think what you're doing is great. And I, would probably do the same thing if I had it to do over again, but my kids are grown up now, but it's more work for parents. Like it is like just straight up, like, I don't think there's any way around that. Like the thing you just mentioned about I hadn't even thought about all of the school stuff that is on tech. But what do you say when parents are like, I don't, I've got enough on my plate. Like, I don't know how I could do this.
Yeah. Well, honestly, an overwhelming pattern that came up in some of these opt-out families that I interviewed and researched and looked through is that it's easier to parent. It is easier to parent when you do not have, kind of the monster of tech rearing its head, or is kind of the like the dysregulation that happens with technology, with a lot of screen time, with iPads, video games, all of it. There is a real neurobiological response that's happening when you are shutting off that stream of dopamine and adrenaline. And so without it, there is kind of, and this happens with adults too, there is a natural rhythm and pattern that slows. You become just kind of, you're keeping in time with your own heartbeat rather than keeping in time with this hard stop and start over and over again. And so I do truly believe that it is easier to parent from a place of no tech, and then you pop it in collectively. So as I would say, if the no tech thing feels overwhelming, moving to at least shared tech with, you're going to put on, an hour of your child's favorite show, just sit next to them and do it with them and get what you need to get done there. If you need to have 30 minutes of Daniel Tiger to put on dinner on the table, do it in a stationary space where it's open. Don't do the headphones or the personal, I'm in my own world and I'm not
Yeah.
responding to the outer world. Those are some kind of great compromises, but I think it is easier to parent without tech than with tech, for many reasons, a lot of them in their book. But
Yeah.
that is not to say that I don't recognize burnout. And I would just say, I trust every parent to make the best decision they can for their home. But I think that there is a necessary awareness to what you're dealing with here. And you're not just look at our own screen time usage. If we can't seem to regulate or moderate, if we're using tech in a way that we wouldn't want our kids to be using tech, then let's start with us,
Mhm.
and that alone is the recognition that we are handing our children something that is by definition addictive, and we don't do that with anything else. And so let's really collectively figure out some better solutions. I think for the school issue, there are some great school tech coalitions. I can send you any of them that are really fighting for why do we have iPads in every child's backpack anyway? And let's kind of unplug some of this. And so you're not alone. And we all can agree that the research has stated otherwise. This is not a healthy solution. So let's not tiptoe around that and let's just get to work.
Yeah. I feel like that tide is changing. Like maybe it's my imagination, but I feel like your book and your message is something that is gathering steam. And like even a few years ago, the conversation was more about like how can we get everyone to have their own personal device, every, kid to have their own personal device. And now so many parents were like, I can't stand the Chromebook that is coming home with my kid every day. And, I don't want them to have a phone until they're in high school. And so I'm really hoping that this is something that's building momentum. Even my 20-year-old this past year, he got rid of all his social media, and he has like a little like a sign on his phone that's a snake to remind himself that the phone is like a snake of his time. And he says that whenever his friends are together, he always is telling everybody, put your phones down, like put your phones away. So I feel like some things are changing, I think. I hope.
Absolutely agree. I think that, yeah, 20 seems to be the age when there's an awakening to why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Nobody's fun. I don't like how this makes me feel. Nobody's having fun anymore. Why? And I think you're right. I think a couple years ago, certainly when I made my own decision to leave social media and delete all of my accounts, there was a lot of why are you why? And now the question is just how are you living like that? Tell me what it looks like in your house and how does it feel? What are the benefits? And I think you're right. There are a lot of shifting conversations around this, and rightfully so.
Yeah. And I think also the research, even a few years ago, wasn't as clear as it is now as to the harms of certain forms of social media and the device time and screen time. So hopefully it's a beginning of a tide of rebellion.
Yeah. Yeah. Rebellion. I like looking at it that way. Like we do have the agency and we can be bold and we can reclaim this.
Yeah, I love it. So, question that I ask all my guests, which is if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, I like that question. You know what? I would say that to get comfortable with waste, get comfortable with wasted what I consider to be wasted time, wasted craft supplies, wasted sort of talents even. I know that sounds a little bit counterproductive, but I think my younger mother self felt like every investment needed to pay off. There needed to be an ROI with everything. It was very much, especially as a homeschooler, I'm thinking if we're going to do Chinese lessons, well, then every child needs to be fluent. If we're going to do violin practice, every child needs to be a musician. And that's not really how learning works. And that's not really how
Yeah.
that. And so I think I would just encourage myself to know that nothing is really ever wasted. And so in a sense, be comfortable with everything that you think is like, gosh, you put so much money into the whittling kit and then there it lays unused. Okay, that's okay. That was a moment that was worth exploring that has been put aside and maybe it will come back around. So I think that is probably the encouragement I would give.
I love that. It sounds like you're talking about backing away from achievement culture.
It probably, yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. So just letting everyone be, letting
Yeah.
them
Because
know
in
their path.
achievement culture, everything has to have its reason for doing it, right? Like that to fill up the child's resume to get into the Ivy League school, and you can't have anything just because. So
Right.
I think you're saying like the opposite of waste is there doesn't have to be a just because. Like you can just do it because you're doing it.
Because you want to do it. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
It sounds
It's not
interesting.
wasted. It's not wasted.
Yeah, no, okay, that's
Yeah.
right.
Where's the best place since you don't have social media, what's your website or the best place to go for people to find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, we do have a website. It's called optoutfamily.com. And it's just really there to put every resource that was in the book where for people want to find more, or if you just want to know how to do this and why, then all of those resources are there. They're all free. There's no sales funnel or there's a program to buy. It's just all free as like a landing pad. So if parents have questions and they want to know what would you do in this scenario or whatever, I always just encourage them to email me. And if there's a resource that's not there, then we'll make it. We're pretty committed to this, to making sure it's accessible for as many people as possible.
That's awesome. And we'll link to all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much. It's a really great conversation. And I encourage everyone to get your book and get more details. And you've got one thing I liked about your book is it's filled with examples and stories and things for people to try and things for people to relate to. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.